what I want to do is just talk for a little bit about what I learned in my travels, particularly following 3 American teenagers to other countries, because I too felt like I needed to see these other countries through the eyes of American kids in order to understand what the research and the data couldn't tell me. So I spent a year doing that and learned some really surprising things, mostly because of the kids. I mean, I could have happily gone off and just followed the data forever on my own and gotten into the weeds on charter schools or vouchers or tenure, but that's not what kids wanted to talk about. They really are not super interested in those policy debates, it turns out. So anyway, so they want to talk about other kids. They want to talk about what other kids are like in other countries. And you forget as an adult how much other students matter. We like to think as parents or teachers or principals that we have this ability to mold and shape kids and everything we do matters, and that might be true, but most of the time they're much more heavily influenced by their peers. And so it's important not to discount that peer effect when we think about how other countries have improved and how they need to get better in certain ways, including the US. But what we're going to talk about today is a little different from what I talked about last night, in case any of you were there. What we're going to talk about is actually, what does it look like? Right before I wrote the book, I had to find a school for my own child in Washington, D.C., where I live. And I was writing about education at the time, and I was like, oh, this is going to be so fun. I'm going to be able to actually put into practice these things I've been writing about. And so I went off and I toured public schools, and I went to open houses at charter schools, and I even went to a couple private schools, and DC has a lot of school choice. About half the kids are in charter schools at this point. So I thought, wow, this is going to be like, a great marathon field trip to explore learning. And I realized very quickly I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea what to look at, what to look for, what to ask. And I'd go to these open houses, and these parents, we'd all be, so full of hope and curiosity and trepidation. And we'd go into these classrooms, and we'd sort of walk around, and we'd stare at the bulletin boards like there was a secret coded in there. If we just looked at them long enough, it would make sense to us, and we'd know if this was a good school, And I was like, this isn't working for me, So then I had all these spreadsheets. My poor husband is, oh my God. And I had spreadsheets because I was like, oh, well, there's all this data, right? One thing we have in this country is data. So I was like, okay, I'm going to, look at the test scores and see what that tells us, if anything. Well, and DC is awash in data. I mean, the streets are flooded with test score data. And Houston, too, I understand. It's something to share. But you're looking at it, and you're like, what the heck am I looking at? I mean, I've been covering education. I've dealt with data in many ways. I graduated, I'm very privileged to go to a very good university. So, and still, what I realize, of course, is that just the raw test scores really doesn't tell you very much, does it? Because you don't know, it depends on the demographics of the students and what they're bringing to the table and what's the school doing. And so you have to create this kind of algorithm in your head to figure out, to control for various variables. And systems often have that information, but they don't always share it in ways that's easy to understand or at all in some cases. So I found it very surprisingly unhelpful to do the normal things to try to understand what a world-class school looked like. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about what does not indicate a world-class education, things that we often think do indicate a world-class education, and then I'm going to talk about what does, particularly using the international data, what that does look like, particularly through the eyes of kids. But before we do that, I think maybe we should talk a little bit about what this means, right? Because, we probably have 100 different definitions just in this room, all of which have some level of validity. I think the first thing to state is obviously it depends on the kid, right? I mean, it really depends on the student, what the student needs, how the student's going to thrive. And it's too bad you can't just pick a different school for your kid for different kids every year. I mean, that's just not how it works, right? So you're left in a situation where you know your kid, you know the system. There's a few other things we know, and so this is how I determine what is world class. we know that in the future, the economy is going to be very unforgiving. It already is. The economy is going to reward highly motivated, highly disciplined, curious people with advanced skills. For them, it's going to be awesome. There's nothing they won't be able to do or find out or execute. For everyone else, it's going to be a struggle, right? And in our country, we don't have a big safety net to fall back into. So right now in the US, this country rewards higher order skills more lavishly than any country in the world, economically speaking. You get paid much more if you have a college degree in the US than the reward you get for having a college degree in Finland, which is a place with much higher education outcomes and less disparity. And you get punished worse in the US for not having higher order skills. And there is no reason to believe that's going to get better. I hate to say that, right? But we know that due to automation, globalization, increases in the technological progress we've seen over the last 10 years, which has been in some ways an inflection point when it comes to storage capacity and processing speed. And so robotics, automation, all these things are leading to a world that is hard to predict. We can't just look at the past 10 years to predict the next 10 years. People try. McKinsey predicts that by 2020 there will be 6 million more Americans without high school degrees than there will be jobs for them. 6 million. And there'll be 1.5 million too few Americans who don't have bachelor's degrees but for whom there would be jobs. So, knowing this, my definition, and in the Q&A, please let me know what your definition is, or argue with my definition. But my definition of world-class education is one that gives kids a fluency in math and writing and basic skills, an ability to really master at a pretty high level the fundamental skills, and then trains them to think for themselves, right? And that's where, not just in our jobs, but in our lives, we really need to be able to think for ourselves. You know, I mean, you all know this, right? To make a decision these days, you have a fire hose of information coming at you. What you don't have is insight and judgment. You have to bring that, right? So in my work, I end up looking a lot at there's different metrics to look at, right? And none of them are perfect. One that I find to be most compelling is the PISA test, which is done by the OECD every 3 years, administered to 500,000 15-year-olds in 70 countries. And the reason I think this test is intriguing, not perfect, but intriguing, is that it's designed to get at these higher order skills. And I took the PISA test to make sure. Andreas Schleicher, did anyone see Andreas when he came from the OECD? So he's like the PISA guru, right? And I took the PISA test to see, because he kept telling me that it was, it measures critical thinking. And I thought, how could that be? How could a test measure that? So I took the test, which was not easy, it turns out. They do not let people just walk in and take the PISA test. There were many emails back and forth with the bureaucracy in Paris, which you can just imagine what that's like. And then, and I had to get an affidavit notarized, so it was very old school. I was like, wow, I have to go to Kinko's and get this notarized. I thought it was kind of exciting. And then there was they sat me down with a young woman who just watched me the whole time to make sure, I guess, I didn't cheat or something, or copy down the questions. So I'm sworn to secrecy about what the exact questions were, lest I help our country improve on the PISA by sharing that information. But what I can tell you is, it was unlike any standardized test I've ever taken. It did require me to have to think. I started out going real fast, I was kind of cocky about it, and then I was like, oh, I'm making mistakes here, actually. I have to slow down. And a lot of the questions required you to write out your answer in long form. And you could tell that there was no right answer, which is just like life, right? It's just like so many things. And you got points based on how compelling and precise your argument was, which meant that it had to be graded by humans, right? So this is very different from your typical American standardized test. So for that reason, I think it's interesting. There is nothing in there I wouldn't want my own kid to be able to do when he's 15. And it wasn't just that it would, I mean, we know that this particular test is predictive of college attainment, more predictive than report card grades. And we know economists have found a nearly one-to-one match between growth on the PISA test and long-term GDP growth. So we know there's some validity for this test, statistically. But also, it's the kind of thing that you need to be able to solve problems you haven't seen before and make judgments and make arguments, just not in your job, but in life, right? So that, to me, is my very long explanation for what I think world class is. Now let's talk a little bit about what that looks like and what it doesn't look like. One thing we know from looking at the international data is there is hope. And we talked more about this last night, but the bottom line is, if you look all around the world, what you see is progress and in some places decline in education outcome. But if you look at the 60 countries that have taken this PISA test since it started in 2000, all those countries, 34 have shown significant gains in at least one subject. The fact that the United States is not one of those countries does not mean it couldn't be, right? So what you see is that our relative stagnation over time, we haven't gotten worse, we haven't gotten dumber, we just haven't gotten smarter as fast as some other countries. And that is actually an exception. That is not the norm. So for me, the number one reason to look at this information is because it's hopeful. I don't know about you, but sometimes I find the US education debate a little bit stifling. It feels like there are days where I'm just like, oh God, I just want to write about drones or something easy, like really. So the international change is really exciting. And once you go to these countries, it's more exciting because what you start to see is there ain't nothing that they're doing that we couldn't do as well or better. Really. It's easy, you get these kind of romantic, idealized visions of Finland and Korea. It's not like that. I mean, every country I've been to, there are good principals and bad. There are principals who are just like on it, who are great leaders, who I would like to work for. And there are principals that kids could not identify in a lineup. In Finland, too, right? There's less variation than there is in the US, but there's still variation. Every country, people fight and argue and weep and gnash their teeth about education. Maybe not as much as in the US, but they do. You know what? That's one of the amazing things is when I did media, when the book first came out, and a new international test results came out, and I'd be on the TV interview on satellite with Australia. Right? Not only are their averages high, but there's not as much variation based on your family's income. And so I had this earpiece and a camera, and you're alone in this room, and it's very creepy. And the woman from Australia says, "Why are we failing our kids, Amanda?" And I'm like, you're not actually. But there is this kind of discontent all over the world. It's just like healthcare, actually. You see the same thing everywhere you go, even much, much more efficient, less wasteful, more effective and healthy systems. People have a lot of complaints about their healthcare system. So we know there is hope. Now what are the clues? How do we know it when we see it? How not to spot a world-class school. Let's start with this, okay? And this is based on my own mistakes, right? This is not, this is an exercise in humility. The facilities matter more to the parents than the kids. And what you find is that there is not a strong relationship between the quality of the facilities past a certain baseline level and the learning. Now you need things to be functional, sanitary, and healthy. You do. And I know we have some schools in which that is not the case. By the way, so do these countries with much better outcomes than we do, including Vietnam and Estonia and other places. So, it's easy though to get seduced by beautiful facilities. So let me just show you a couple pictures of facilities in the schools that the American kids I followed went to in these other countries that have dramatically better outcomes, not just on the PISA test, but high school graduation, college attainment, equity, other things. So this is a field. This is a typical playing field, athletic field, in many schools and countries around the world. This is in South Korea, in the city of Busan, a big booming city on the ocean. There's cranes everywhere. There's a lot of energy, feeling of progress and growth. And this is a pretty well-respected high school, public high school, where a boy I followed from Minnesota ended up for a year. And this is it. So you see that this is the facility is nice, the tidy school there, but this is where the grass ranks in the order of priorities, right? And now I know we have all seen American schools that do not look like this, that have beautiful green fields. I've been in schools in DC with fields I just want to roll around on the grass. It's so beautiful and lush. And that school is failing those kids every single day. This is outside of a school I went to in Finland. This was a school that was such a cool school. It was actually, I went there because it was right outside of Helsinki, and it had 30% immigrant kids, which is unusual for Finland, right? So that's why I wanted to go, is well, it's all well and good when you got all your Finns there. What happens when you have kids who don't speak the language? And this school, as most of those kids are actually refugee kids from Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan. So it's really interesting to see the teachers try to adapt to those challenges. Anyway, this school is killing it. You know, despite what they say, Finland does do some standardized testing. They do sampling, kind of like the NAEP test here, to see if schools are if anybody's falling behind. It's not public, but the government does it. And then they did this. These kids were performing above average in math for kids all over Finland, which means above average all over the world. But anyway, you can see, it's not a beautiful sign. You get my point. This is the school in America that the kid I followed came from, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This is ridiculous. I think we can all agree. Like, when you go inside, it's really, there's these amazing labs and a sort of state-of-the-art theater, and it's just every classroom has a smart board and a smart projector and all smart floor, whatever. And this school, only a third of the kids are even taking an AP class. And this school, when kids take the SAT, their math scores are below the national average for the SAT, which means, below this, right? And these kids are in 6th grade, just to be clear. And this is the high school. So okay, how many people are teachers here? It's important to work in pleasant surroundings. I like to work in pleasant surroundings, right? We all do. But you also know what I'm saying, right? That's not enough, okay? How not to spot a world-class school. Admire the technology. I kind of hinted at this earlier, but this is another thing. So it turns out, this is something the American kids I followed noticed, that in their other countries, in Finland, South Korea, and Poland in this case, they did not see classroom technology. In fact, all of them, even the ones who came from kind of struggling schools with significant levels of poverty in the U.S., had more classroom technology in the U.S. than in their borrowed countries. Now, does that mean that technology is, makes us dumber? Well, maybe, but probably not, right? It probably means that we're not using it typically in ways that lead to learning. And we know there's a lot of evidence for that in the US research. But again, it is easy as a parent, I think, to get kind of seduced by, iPads for everyone, or whatever. So as we can see, I don't know if you followed Los Angeles, but when they decided to give iPads to all their students, it's been kind of a fiasco, right? Since they did. There's different reasons for that, but one thing that often happens is, they put the technology on like frosting, right? So they don't actually change fundamentally what they're doing, but they give it to kids, they give it to teachers without a lot of training, and then they lock it up with firewalls because they don't trust the kids. So, they don't want them doing anything naughty or even fun. And then the kids hack the firewalls, so the game is on, right? The game is on without them. I think there was a kid charging $5 and he could hack your iPad LAUSD firewall. That kid is going to be fine, by the way. But what happens is, and then they break, and then they need upgrades, and then, and so while iPads may or may not, in improve learning, it's not something that we've found to be a highly productive use of money so far. Maybe that will change, but it would be good to have a little caution and say, yes, I'll buy that technology after you show me evidence that it leads to learning, right? So that's something that I've learned. Another thing that I've learned from the kids that I follow, this girl is so fascinating. This girl I met through the American I was following in Korea. Her name is Jenny. She was born in South Korea. Then when she was a little girl, her family moved to Pittsburgh. And then after about 7 years in the US, during which time she really was very Americanized, you know, she'd go to school, and then she went to swim lessons, and she had sleepovers, whatever. Then in middle school, they went back to Korea. And so she had a rude awakening, because now all her friends did was they went to school, and then they went to what they call hagwons in Korea, which are after-school tutoring academies where they repeat all the subjects that they just learned in school. It's a very inefficient, high-stress, expensive way to get to the top of the world. It is a way. Just make no mistake. It is one path to the top of the world. But Jenny was not a huge fan. Interestingly, though, Jenny's parents stayed the same. She was with her mom most of the time, and her mom, you didn't really, push her to do one or the other thing, unlike a lot of Korean parents, but she behaved differently depending on the kids around her. So when her friends were not super into school, and when they had a very holistic life, and they did all kinds of activities, that's what she did. And when she came back to Korea, she was very hard on herself. She said to me, all the Korean kids are ranked nationally in high school, so they know where they stand. And she told me her ranking, and I think it put her in the top 10% of the country. It was very impressive. But she said, I know I can do better. She was really chagrined about this outcome. And she wouldn't have been, right, probably most likely in the US. But one of the things the kids noticed, I've surveyed hundreds of exchange students, and 7 out of 10 said they saw more technology in their US schools. So this was sort of surprising, but there is a little bit of data, not a lot, that it does show that by sophomore year of high school, American schools on average, right, this is an average, have a 1-to-1 ratio of computers to students. That is extremely high for the developed world. So in Poland, it's more like 1 to 3, so 1 computer for 3 students. In Finland and South Korea, by the way, those are very wired, digitally sophisticated places, more so than the US in many ways, it's 1 computer for 2 students. Okay, how else? This last way to not spot a world-class school. This may be a little counterintuitive. Watch the teacher. Well, I found that, it's all good to watch the teacher, but sometimes as lay people, we go into the school, we stare at the teacher, we stare at the bulletin boards, we stare at the teacher, and we're not really sure what we're looking for, partly because we're not there all year long, right? So we can't see exactly what it is, where the kids were and what's happening now. And you can see some things, right? Like you can see if it's a total madhouse, like if it's just chaos, right? You can see that. But you can't see necessarily by looking at the teacher if rigorous learning is happening, if these children are learning to think for themselves. So what do we look at? Because we know, particularly in math, at every age and income level in this country, we lack rigorous learning. That we are actually underestimating what kids can do. So we need to be able to see it. So now what? Do we really have to rely on our sort of not very smart standardized tests to figure out if rigorous learning is happening? The best way to find out if rigorous learning is happening is to watch the kids. I learned this actually from Tim Daly, who runs an organization called TNTP, and they train teachers, and he said to me, you're doing it wrong. You got to watch the kids. And it's not intuitive. It takes you a while to stop staring at the bulletin boards and stop staring at the teacher and watch the kids. But all over the world, in every classroom I went to, that's what I did. And what you notice right away is that if the kids are not engaged, they will be super excited that you have come into the room. They will be, because they're bored out of their minds. You know what I'm saying? So you come in and they're like, and then you sneeze and they're like, do you need a tissue? And you're like, no, it's okay. You're trying to be invisible. If they're engaged in meaningful work, they don't have time for you. And so you can tell. right? You can tell if all of the kids are working. Now, does it always have to look like this? No, it does not, right? It's not, we're not watching TV, right? Like, not all kids have to be happy all the time, right? What they should be doing is engaged in productive struggle, right? So they're not despairing, but they're not breezing through a worksheet like they're filling out a form, right? Like a dot to dot. Like, that's not how it should look. So watching the kids for signs of productive struggle, the teachers in here know this, so I apologize, but that is something that I think most of us in America don't know to look for, don't know what it looks like. Here's what it does not look like. This is another picture in South Korea. I blurred out the kids' faces, but they're flat out sleeping. And that teacher is giving a lesson. This is very common all over Korea. And the teachers just lecture on. The reason the kids are sleeping in some of the, not all, but in many of the classes, is because they've been up so late studying, which is crazy town, right? I think we can agree. And the kids will tell you that this is a crazy system, and there's just so much anxiety around education, and there's not enough trust in the system. So then everybody feels like, well, if the neighbor's kid is going to Hagwons, then I got to send my kid, and on the cycle goes. It's a lot, actually, when I try to explain it to American kids, Korean education is hard to explain, right? Because it's a carnival. It's like a free market carnival of education. The only way I can explain it to Americans is to, think in your head about how we are about sports, right? At every level. Like how we train, how serious it is, what big money it is. And just do a find place for education. It is the exact same intensity. The exact same craziness. Talk to the students. It's okay. You can talk to them. Like, it's okay. And they know more than we think. They are education experts whom no one ever calls to testify. No one ever calls them to testify, right? But they are, trust me, they know more than 90% of the education experts who write education white papers, who are not teachers, right, by the way, like me. They know a lot. And they will tell you, but you have to ask them the right questions. You have to ask them intelligent questions. What are you doing right now? That's important. More important is the second question. Why? What I find is kids can often answer the first. If they can't answer the first, that's another. But then they can't answer why. And if we want to have kids think for themselves, right? They need to be able to answer why. Another good question to ask, and there are more of these in the book, but if you don't understand something in this class, what do you do? In a rigorous classroom, there are systems, and you know what to do if you don't understand. And it might be different things. There might be 3 or 4 things. It might depend on what the teacher's preferences are, or how the classroom works, or what the subject is, but there is a system. So to find out what kids know and how valuable their insight could be, I thought instead of just telling you, I'd prove it to you. So this is where we have a video from Tom, an American kid who went from Pennsylvania to Poland for the year. And you're going to hear from him his thoughts, uncensored, about school in Pennsylvania and Poland.
Basically, high school just was kind of a stagnant environment for me. Well, what was important in high school? It's like prom, football games, dating people, and there was no one wanted to actually learn anything, and no one wanted to discover the world or something. I think high school could definitely be more engaging, but it's not a question of how much technology we have in the classroom, of whether we have iPads and laptops, because all of my classes we do have laptops, and in all of my classes we use smartboards. And what do kids do on their laptops? They play flash games, and smartboards don't work all the time, and if they do, then you're not doing anything that you wouldn't do on a chalkboard. The classroom's a much more sober environment. There's no joking around between student and teacher like there is in America. And there's certainly no talking back, and there's no conflict in class.
But the point is, students have a lot of strong opinions on school. They have a lot to say, positive, negative, and in between, and they'd be happy to share it with people if they were only asked. In fact, we know that if students are asked survey questions that are intelligent and have been researched, and which are now out there for free, They are better at identifying which teachers need the more help and which teachers are really killing it, and in actionable ways. Like, unlike test scores, they are actually telling you, some of the questions that have found to be more predictive than, say, classroom observations or test scores. Some of the questions are things like, kids in this class behave the way my teacher wants them to most of the time. Or, when I struggle with something, this teacher does not let me give up. So what teachers have found through these surveys is that at first they're reluctant, understandably, but then they find that they get information they did not know that they can act on, unlike with standardized tests where you're just looking at some results and it's hard to know what to do with them necessarily. So asking the kids is very important. And the last thing is obviously to interview the principal like you're trying to decide whether to spend your whole life working for that person. The same things that you would care about in a leader in any job are the things that make a great principal. So what are the things to ask a principal? The teachers have probably other ideas on this as well, which I'd love to hear in the Q&A. But to me, maybe the key thing is, in the United States, teachers spend more time teaching than in almost every country in the world. So it's not that they're working more hours total, necessarily, but they have no downtime. So they are instructing all day long, which would sort of be like saying, okay, let's try to have really the best litigators in the world, and we'll have them in court talking before a judge all day long, and then they go home. So no, that's not how lawyers work, right? Like, they spend time researching and writing and thinking and debating with their colleagues, talking to their clients. And the same is true with teachers in the highest performing countries in the world. They have more time to not only collaborate with each other and plan their lessons, because most of this is about planning and preparing rigorously, right? The best elementary schools in the world, those teachers plan those read-alouds like they're ready to defend a dissertation. I mean, the questions are serious, intellectual, thought-through, deliberate questions. But you need time to do that. So the question that I would ask principals is, how do you carve out time so that your teachers can plan and collaborate, watch each other teach, which almost never happens in US schools, and really master this incredibly challenging craft? This is a huge challenge. One of the reasons for that is because, even though it might not feel like it, we have invested in smaller class sizes over the years than many countries around the world. Every country in the world has strong teachers unions. All the high-performing countries have strong teachers unions, and they have contracts, and it makes it hard. There's not as much time and flexibility. There are some countries where the contract is more professional than in some of our states and districts. But in general, there's always constraints, and finding the time and really prioritizing that over things like class size, which beyond the early grades we know does not actually yield the kind of returns we want beyond a certain point. Having time to go watch each other teach is so important. I met a great teacher in Florida the other day, and she said, she's like the only AP English teacher in her high school, and she said, I'm so desperate to learn from colleagues, but there's no other English teacher. So I told my principal, I'll take a personal day. I'll take a personal day and I want to go watch some great teachers in the district, big district. And she asked her principal, is there like a list of 10 really, rock star teachers that I could go watch or willing to let me into their classroom? And she was like, no, you don't know. That doesn't exist. So she had to kind of go find her way to figure out like who she could watch. So that kind of infrastructure, having that not set up is unheard of in, say, a place like Japan, where they have regular public lesson studies where teachers come from all over, sometimes thousands of teachers, to watch really great teachers teach a lesson, and then they debrief it. They go into exactly what happened and why, and what could be better. And teachers in the US have to do this themselves. They have to create this from whole cloth, right, in all their spare time. I met a band teacher in Chicago the other day who, he wants to collaborate, but there's no network for that. So he created this informal network of other music teachers in the area. And you know what they do? Don't tell anyone this, because I want to write about this. Okay, I just realized I shouldn't be talking about this. I'm just kidding. Seriously. They decide they're each going to teach the same piece of music one semester. And then they go watch each concert that each other does, the final concerts for the band. And then they decide which was the best. That doesn't usually happen in teaching, right? People don't use words like that. And you know why they decide which is the best? Not to pin a medal on the guy, but to sit down for 2 hours over beers and figure out what he did, so they can do it next time. That is how you deal with an intellectually challenging craft, not in isolation. So we know that the thing about principals is, they are the only ones that you can predict. You can't predict which teacher your kid's going to get, and teachers can't control many things in the school. But principals matter. And you have to interrogate them and ask them the hard questions and expect clear answers. The last thing I'll say, and then we want to open up to questions, is, when I was on this crazy odyssey trying to find a school for my own kid, I also looked at some Tony private schools in DC. And I went to one, I think it was $35,000 a year, this school, which we couldn't afford. But I kind of want to know what we were missing, you know what I'm saying? So I went there, I was curious, I was like, what is this all about? And it was beautiful. It was like a learning spa. There was all this like natural light. And they had all these like muffins and stuff. And I was like, oh, they have muffins. And I was starting to get seduced. Like I could feel it, And then the principal came and she talked to her headmaster or whatever she was. And she talked to us about the school. And she had some charts and some things. Nothing she said made sense. It was like, wah, 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 wah. It was like all this jargon and like expeditions and, discovery and all this kind of like teacher jargon, and I was like, what is happening? And I'm looking around and I can tell no one else really knows what she means, but, everybody here wants their kid to get in. So it's this very weird dynamic, right? It's like a first date is off, it's terrible. And so then after that, we went walking around, one of the parents who has 3 kids in the school. So she's stroking a check for almost $100,000 in this place every year.
Wow.
And we're walking around, she's giving us a tour, and one of the parents asked this great question. He said, what do you think, the classic interview question. He said, so we know there are lots of strengths. What is a weakness of the school? And she said, right away, without even thinking about it, she said, the math program is weak. And I was like, hold up, wait. It's $35,000. You're making 5-year-olds take an IQ test to get in here, right? So you literally, you want to talk about charter school screaming. That is screaming, right? Like that is skimming, okay? And you're giving him an interview to make sure he's not going to cause you any trouble, right? And your math program is weak. And this is a country that is systematically underperforming in math. So I was like freaking out. My husband was like, be cool. But needless to say, we did not apply to that school. My son ended up in a brand new charter school for the first year, and then he was able to go to his traditional public school in our neighborhood. And it's not perfect. Like I still have to bite my tongue all the time and occasionally speak. It does not have the effect always that I want, but still. That's where we're at, and I really appreciate you all coming out and listening to me, and now I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. Thank you.